Inspiring interviews with today's top landlords. This is the Rental Income Podcast. And now, Dan Lane.
Occasionally, tenants are going to run into some kind of financial difficulty and fall behind on rent. I know this has happened to me a couple of times, but Derek, you've been very successful in working with tenants and helping them get caught up. Can you tell me your thinking and how you approach this?
As landlords and property managers, we always want to be able to reduce turnover and be able to enhance our communities. And so by being able to work with those and showing a little bit more patience and empathy, we're able to achieve both of those results.
There's definitely bad tenants out there. And I think if you've got one of them, you're better off just cutting ties and getting them out of the property as soon as you can. But if you've got a good tenant that is just going through a temporary financial hardship, I think Derek has a good point that you're going to actually make more money by working with them and helping them get caught up. And on the podcast today, we're going to talk about how Derek has done this. Derek also uses a couple different charities to help tenants out. We'll get some details on how that works too. Joining us on the show today from Cedar Creek, Utah is Derek Morton. We'll take a quick break to thank our sponsors. We'll come right back and we'll talk to Derek. It's a lot of work to find a really good rental property. And when you actually find that property, you want to make sure you're working with a lender that can get that loan closed. The lender that I recommend is Chaley Ridge from Ridge Lending Group. She's a nationwide lender and her specialty is helping investors finance rental properties. She has a ton of loan programs and she can find something customized to you for your situation. If you want to find out more or you're ready to get started today, just go to ridgelendinggroup.com. That's RIDGE lendinggroup.com, NMLS 42056. Investing in rental properties can be complicated, but it doesn't have to be. My friends at Mid-South Home Buyers sell completely rehab turnkey properties in both Memphis and Little Rock, and they've been doing it for 23 years. All their properties come totally rehab. They put on a new roof, new kitchen, new bath, new plumbing, new electric. Everything is brand new. They also have a tenant that's moved in before you close, so you get cash flow on day one. Mid-South Home Buyers also continues to manage the property for you after closing. It couldn't be easier. Everything is 100% done for you. All their properties also come with a couple of guarantees. They have a 1-year total maintenance warranty and a lifetime occupancy guarantee. Personally, I just closed on my 5th property with Mid-South Home Buyers, and I couldn't be happier. If you want to talk to a happy customer, reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions, or you can check them out at midsouthhomebuyers.com. Derek, you own a property management company. How long have you been managing properties for?
So I started NetGain Property Management about 8.5 years ago. And so I've been managing them the entire time.
Do you have properties yourself that you own?
I don't currently. I sold those a few years ago, but we'll be jumping back in the next year or so.
And how many properties do you manage?
We currently manage 625 units.
Okay, so I mean, you're dealing with a lot of tenants every month. Do you see like a lot of tenants falling behind on rent, or is it a very low percentage?
It's a low percentage, but it's, it comes in binges and everything. And certain times of the year, like this is the, November, December, January is usually a higher delinquency month, time of year.
How do you work with tenants? Walk me through what you do. So if I'm a tenant and I can't pay rent this month or whatever, how does the conversation go?
So the big thing is hopefully they're communicating with us and they have reached out and said, hey, there's usually 3 situations. One, I can't pay rent by the 5th, but I'll have it on the 10th. Some small crisis or paycheck gets delayed, and those are easy to work with, right? It's like, right. Boom, okay, no problem. Pay on the 10th. As long as you pay on the 10th, we're good. We've got the late fee, and no problem. Second one is some sort of more minor emergency. So an accident or health issues that have stopped them from being able to work, and so they're going to be delayed a little bit longer. And so with those, if they've communicated, we'll get the owners involved and be able to communicate, hey, here's the situation. We let the owners kind of have a hands-on, like, how do you want to work with them on this? And we put together a plan, whether that's we put them on a payment plan so that they can pay it back, or they, we work with different organizations so we can put them on, hopefully find them funding that can help with a short term for 1 month's rent. And then there's the third that's like it's a major crisis, loss of job, and so they're waiting for unemployment, or there's major health issues, or death, divorce, like all those things, and those you have to deal with just a little bit more differently. Sometimes like those you're not able to keep them able to, because we know they can't afford it, and you work with what's the best way to exit, to minimize damage to the owners and to the tenants in those cases, or they were able to work with these organizations, and sometimes we're able to find them some longer term funding as they work through that crisis at hand, until they're able to get more stabilized.
There's been a few times where I've had tenants that have fallen behind or run into financial trouble, and I find occasionally somebody gets into a tough spot and they just stop communicating. They're not returning calls. We don't hear from them. How do you deal with that? Because like I'm like you. I think it's a better idea to work with them. But if they're not taking your calls, like what do you do?
If they're not willing to take their calls, that's a completely different situation. And that's like, cool. If you're not willing to talk to me and work with me, like why would I do the same to you?
Yeah.
And so if they haven't done that, those are different circumstances. It's like, cool, you haven't returned my phone call, you haven't paid rent, like here's the 3-day notice where we're in Utah, and we can start that process. And usually then all of a sudden that, post that 3-day notice, and then all of a sudden the phone calls, comes in, you're like, why did I have to chase you? Like,
right. Do you tell them up front, like when you're signing the lease with them, when they first move in, that, hey, if you run into trouble, let us know? Like communication is so important.
And yeah, like that's the biggest thing, is like, if you run into an issue, there's very few things that we're not going to be able to work with. And what we've found is if we're good at communicating as well, then tenants, more times than not, are pretty good at communicating too.
Mm-hmm.
If we fail to communicate on our end, like it's really difficult to get after. Well, it's not difficult to get after a tenant if they're failing to communicate on their end, but you don't have as much legitimacy, and they're kind of like, you're a hypocrite,
Right.
like we had these issues and you ghosted us, so like screw you, right?
Right.
So
You mentioned that there was like some organizations that you work with if the tenant falls really far behind. How does that work?
So it depends on the organization. A lot of it is funded through donations, or there's federal grants. So there's a couple organizations that have some eviction prevention funds that they can help get them caught up with their rent, and potentially cover an additional month. So that keeps them housed and hopefully gets them another 30 days to stabilize and find solutions, so they can be able to move forward in the house.
And the organization pays you directly?
Yeah, they'll pay us directly.
And do they move pretty quick? Like, so that if maybe it's the 10th, it's obvious that the tenant has some kind of problem where they're not going to be able to pay. Do they move pretty quick to get you paid?
They, for the most part, they do. Usually what's nice is the relationship we have with these different organizations. So as if a tenant has reached out to them, the tenant may not even have given us a heads up yet.
Mm-hmm.
But then that organization will usually reach out and be like, hey, just so you know, we're working with this person. There's sometimes documentation they need, like the lease and the ledger. And we send that over, and usually we're able to get the check within a couple weeks. If it's a little bit longer, we can usually communicate with the owner. We're like, we work with this organization. They pay us all the time. This check's a little bit delayed. You're going to get, you're going to get your money.
Yeah.
Here's the heads up. And the owner's like, cool. It's usually like, we're going to get the late fee too. And you're like, yes, you're getting paid the late fee. And so that's how we're able to work those organizations. And we've worked with them for years and years and years. And so it's a pretty smooth process. And I know our experience in Utah, like most of these organizations are a lot more efficient. And I know elsewhere around the country, as I've talked to other, property managers and stuff, they don't have same experience with some of those organizations, because this is like, hey, this tenant to working with those organization, and it took me 2 months to get the check. And it really becomes, difficult as a property manager. It's like, okay, I need the money, they signed the lease. But I can't wait 2 months for it. I'd like to keep them in, but I can't wait 2 months. Like, that's just not going to work. And so part of it was, with us, like, these organizations are pretty efficient in cutting us checks, but we've also educated them, like, we have to be pretty quick.
How do you find these organizations?
So before I started NetGain, I was on the board for one of the, like, our local homeless shelter. And so I was familiar with them. And then that just helped network us out into some of these other organizations, that we're able to develop relationships.
And these are local organizations in your area. It's not like a national.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. They're all local.
If anybody is looking for a charity or an organization in their area, a good place to start is 211.org or needhelppayingbills.com. Those are two pretty good sites.
Yep. So, I mean, and so, if you're looking, as a landlord, like, I would Google like your local homeless shelter or DV shelter, or I would Google rent relief type things. And that usually will bring up other organizations. And I mean, and it wouldn't hurt to be like, hey, here's the situation. I just need a little bit, learn more about what you have to offer. Because those organizations are there to help, and so most of them, in my experience, as we've been expanding throughout the state of Utah, being able to meet with some of those organizations, they're more than willing to have those lunches and meetings to be able to go, okay, yeah, how do we make it work, for you guys? And most of the time they're pretty open-minded. Like, here's what I have to have happen, and here's why. And they're like, oh, that makes sense. I can't really take 2 months. And so how do we make this more efficient so we can actually, make this work and do what we need to do and actually help these tenants that are in need and in crisis?
Do you think there's any risk that if the tenant knows that you're going to be flexible and you're going to work with them, that maybe they won't prioritize paying the rent, that maybe they're going to pay their other bills first before the rent, and then they get into a cycle where they're always behind? Like, have you run into that?
Well, yeah, but you don't let them go in the cycle. Like, so it's, hey, like, and as I say that, we have some tenants that, like, the way their disability or Social Security gets paid on this day, and we've let the owner know, like, hey, they can pay rent on this day, and this is the situation, right? And most owners are good with that.
With a company your size, I would imagine that you're probably screening tenants exactly the same every time.
Correct.
So, like, is there like a red flag that you see that's maybe an indication that someone's going to fall behind on rent?
It's usually credit.
Okay.
That's the vast majority. So, like, our credit, we require 600. We go down to 580 with a double deposit. And sometimes if you go into the 550, 560, we've had some success with some additional protections. But if you're in the low 500s, early 400s, up high 400s, I mean, unless, like, they've had a file for, like, medical bankruptcy, right? Because they have no control over that. They got cancer, they got whatever, and and their credit got tanked. Like, those are different situations. but for the most part, it credits what we've seen is the number one indicator.
And then what else are you looking for? Like what else are you like when you're trying to decide if you're going to rent to someone or not? What other criteria are you looking at?
So we kind of went against the grain. We dropped from 3 times rent to income down to 2 times rent to income.
Oh, wow.
Just because, as we discussed earlier, rents were increasing faster than wages, and that still kind of hasn't stabilized. And so,
like,
go ahead.
That's interesting. So I would think, so 3 times the rent. That means if you're going to rent a property for $1,000 a month, you want the tenant to make at least $3,000 a month, and so. Like that seems to be like a safe number where the person's going to be easily able to afford the rent every month. But if they're making 2,000 and the rent is 1,000, like I just my gut feeling is that you're going to have tenants that won't be able to afford the rent. Like, but that's not how it's worked out.
It hasn't. It's been really nice. We've been able to help people that really weren't able that struggle to find housing, right? And we did some things, like we made an adjustment when we dropped that. So we at the same time, we used to always have rent, or the deposit matched the rent. So if the rent was 1,000, the deposit was 1,000. But when we dropped to the 2 times rent to income, we increased the deposit to 1.5 times. So the deposit would be 1,500, which is why we started looking at those security deposit of alternatives. Cause I'm like, we still need to make sure that property is filled, and what we're doing isn't making it more difficult. And so it's just all trying to find that balance between those 3 things, right? That we discussed earlier.
So you're not seeing more delinquent rent payments because your qualification is low. Wow.
We've stayed the same. Our delinquencies haven't gone up. We haven't had, everyone's afraid because it's so easy to be like, oh, if they're making more money, they're going to be better tenants, and all these things, right? We have all this implicit bias that comes into play.
Right.
But we haven't seen any of that.
Wow. So do the properties rent a lot faster?
Yeah, we've been able to rent the properties faster. And as the market's adjusting to more of a normal market, as opposed to the insanity that we had during and post COVID, like it's still, those have made our properties attractive.
Yeah.
And we're able to get them filled. And so like for us, like it's better for the owners, because very few properties now, because you're starting to see like the rent discounts, right? So the move-in special is a whole lot of like, oh, we'll give you 2 months rent free to move in, today, and you have those requirements. And so we've been able to balance. And once again, like I'm just judging from our market, like into so many things are market specific. But lowering it to the 2.5 times, having some alternatives, so we have the increased protection for the owner on the deposit. We've been able to keep stuff moving pretty quick without having to offer those rent discounts, and really without any increase in percentage of difficult tenants.
What price point are your properties at?
Our average rent in our portfolio is about $1,500 a month.
Okay. Wow. I mean, that would make me really nervous as an owner to accept that, but it seems like it's working out for you. So there's probably I'm probably off base being nervous about that.
It took some convincing. It took some hard conversations.
Yeah.
And a lot of it just came down to, I'm like, you hired me. Do you trust me or not? If I fail, I'll fail, and we'll have that conversation, and you can say, I told you so. If we're successful, then I'll tell you I told you so.
Right.
And life is good.
Finding a good property manager is, I think, one of the hardest parts of being an investor. I mean, there's just so many managers out there that aren't that good. Well, what advice would you give to someone that's looking for a property manager? Like, are there certain questions you would ask, or certain things that you would look for in their business?
One, how many inspections do you do a year? because that'll tell you everything. If they're doing they should be at least doing one. Sometime during the lease, they should be in there. If they're going to charge you to do one inspection during the year, they're not going to be taking care of your property. So they should at least do one inspection a year. Figure out what fees they're going to charge, because some it's like, okay, we've got the management fee, and then there's a tenant placement fee. There's markups on maintenance, and all sorts of different things that can be charged. And so find out what fees they're going to charge you and what what those help cover that are separate than the management fee. Mm-hmm. Those fees aren't necessarily good or bad, but you should be able to be educated so you know what's going in. The cheapest option is not always the best. I know that we're looking to make money, and it's easy to try to negotiate down, and you'll interview 5 different management companies, and you're going to be like, okay, this one is going to charge me a less management fee and it has less fees, and so I'm going to go with that one. And that's not always your best option. Right. And so be willing to take the time to ask those 3 questions and understand. And the most expensive isn't always the best option either. And so price isn't always the determining factor on what what is the best management company for you.
If you own properties in Southern Utah or Salt Lake and you're looking for a property manager, I've got Derek's contact information on the website. You can find it at rentalincomepodcast.com/episode 509. I'd like to thank Chaley Ridge from Ridge Lending Group for sponsoring today's episode. If you're looking to buy a rental property, whether you're just getting started or you want to add to your portfolio and you're looking for a great lender, reach out to Chaley Ridge. You can track her down at ridgelendinggroup.com. NMLS 42056. Thank you so much for checking out the podcast today. Make sure you hit the follow button. I put out a new episode every single Tuesday, and if you're following the show, you'll get notified when the next episode comes out. My name is Dan Lane, and this has been the Rental Income Podcast.